context, a way of thinking, understanding the Russian approach to Syria. First, so in a sense, bear with me as I develop this framework, and then I will narrow down to seeking to explain Russian conduct in the Syria crisis in particular, and I'll be very open to questions on the specificities of the recent diplomatic exchanges as well. Well, I think it's clear that Russia's been at the heart of controversy over military intervention on Syria. The relentless, bitter human cost of the Syrian conflict and the rising danger of severe regional destabilization makes it essential, I think, to understand why Moscow has been so adamantly opposed to external Western intervention in the crisis, and secondly, to the insistence of major Western states that Assad has lost the right to rule Syria. And I'll try to do this by developing an argument about Russia has viewed the rules on the use of force during the post-Cold War era and why it has thought in this way. Now, this is partly about international law and norms, interpretations of that, as well as efforts to constrain Western power. But crucially, it's also about, in my view, about how Russian leaders have been driven by a preoccupation with domestic state order. That is the political structure they preside over at home. And so that, I think, is going to be the core, or perhaps different part of my argument, but some of that you are exposed to. So let's begin by recalling that interventions by major powers have reverberated through the international system, from the first Gulf conflict in 1990, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, Georgia, Libya. And such coercive use of force has mostly been accompanied by efforts to alter political arrangements in the target states. Controversies have flared over the legal, normative, and political justifications for these operations. And this has weakened the common ties of international society and undermined consensus on basic principles of international order, which is why this is so important. Looking at these interventions over a 20-year period, one axis of tension stands out in particular. Since the early 1990s, Russia has been the most persistent and prominent critic of Western-led campaigns, except in the case of the Afghanistan operation. And it's used its permanent membership of the United Nations Security Council to project its own understanding of the norms and law regulating the use of force. Overall, during the post-Cold War years, Russia has agreed only occasionally with major Western states over the coercive use of force against states, as opposed to United Nations peacekeeping. In some respects, Russia has adapted to wider normative currents and the evolution of customary international law over the use of force. But generally, it's tended to resist change. And this is very much the story of the Libya crisis. At the beginning of the Libya crisis in March 2011, Russia briefly used humanitarian language, but quite quickly it reverted to its conventional, trenchant opposition to Western-led intervention, which has been fully displayed since then in the Security Council wrangles over Syria. Though in the first part of this talk I wish to draw from my book to explain the persistence of Russian resistance to Western-led intervention, to any broadening of the United Nations category of threats to international peace and security to include humanitarian emergencies. And then I'll apply this to the acute controversy over Syria. Well, a major concern in my book is to examine the legal and normative justifications for action or inaction which Russia and Western powers have presented for their military interventions since the Gulf War in 1990. And I chart the struggle between states to reach agreed standards of conduct. The book's about norms, which we could define as standards of appropriate behaviour, but it's also about the exercise of power. And it's clear that the diplomatic wrangling over interventions has been highly political. It's been shaped by disparities in power between states. And as a former superpower, Russia has struggled to adjust to dramatic changes in its relative power, to strong challenges to international rulemaking, as well as efforts to loosen constraints on the use of force led by the United States, particularly under George W. Bush. However, beyond the calculus of power, I argue that tensions between Russia and Western states over the use of force in humanitarian emergencies and the acceptability of regime change as an outcome of intervention arise from what we could say is normative friction. And this reflects quite persistent Russian understandings of regional and domestic order, ultimately rooted in the nature of the Russian state, a theme I'll return to. As a result, Russian leaders are skeptical about international justice focused on individuals rather than states, and remain wedded to the language of sovereignty and non-intervention. At another level, Russian tension with the Kosovo crisis has reflected basic differences about who establishes the normative agenda in the first place. This is a question about who makes the rules. Some have called this one of constitutionalist procedures in the global system. This is expressed in Putin's assertion of rightful influence in the international system, as he sees it, his sense of entitlement in influencing global decision-making, and in the way that Russia prizes its Security Council membership. Russia has tried to rally support for its positions from major emerging powers, particularly the BRICS group, states which promise a shift in global politics and could constrain the influence of Western states in setting global standards and rules of behaviour. What role then is played by international law in Russian thinking? This is a complex topic, and I won't go into it in detail. We find that despite some waverings over responses to international terrorism, Moscow's tended to hold fast to a position of international legal positivism over the use of force. And international legal positivists claim that only unilateral or collective self-defense and Security Council enforcement action under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter can form exceptions to the Charter's general prohibition on the use of force. So it's a good restrictive view. And Moscow rejects claims that individuals should be the subjects of international law, and the role of international law should be the protection of human rights, even if the Russian state formally accepts the binding quality of international humanitarian law. In essence, I mean, in my view anyway, in essence, Russia expects international law to regulate the competition of states, to constrain Western power, as well as to provide what we could call a kind of discursive shield for the Russian state, rather than to protect human beings. Where does this leave Russian thinking on international legitimacy? Well, in its public rhetoric, Moscow often links legitimacy to lawful conduct in terms of the international legal system. However, Moscow's viewed international legitimacy especially, it seems to me, as conduct which complies with a legally structured constitutional order at the global level as expressed through the UN Charter system. So it's back to the role of the United Nations Charter, in which Russia, of course, through the Security Council, has veto power. To legitimise military intervention, this, in the Russian perspective, requires a focus on procedural rules rather than basic values. The question of who gets to make the rules and who defines the normative agenda then becomes of abiding concern to Russian leaders. And for Russia, this is also a question about international status, Russian international status and leverage, which of course suffered a steep decline during the 1990s, and really since then the Russian political elite has struggled ever since then to try and restore for Russia some sense of international grandeur. So this psychological issue of status is also there. So when Russia felt that its Security Council veto was eclipsed over Kosovo in 1999 and Iraq in 2003, it shook Russian confidence and rankled deeply. Similarly, Putin has been allergic to the planned extension of NATO's global role, to the prospect of NATO not just consulting with the United Nations, but not submitting to Security Council authorization on the use of force. And you could read NATO strategies as moving in that direction. In summer 2010, Lavrov, foreign minister, rather testily responded to this possibility by saying, this will provoke the temptation to say, if NATO can do it, why can't we? And even in the case of Libya in 2011, with the authorization for intervention that was provided by Resolution 1973, Russia claimed that a group of Western states had seized the agenda over the use of military force as with earlier interventions in Kosovo and Iraq. And Russia worries about this recurring through action not just against Syria, but Iran. It's difficult to conceive of any Western or Israeli use of force against Iran achieving Security Council endorsement, because this would depend, of course, on Russian approval and a Chapter 7 resolution. But the dilemma here for Russia has been how to prevent the Security Council approving action against Iran without this blocking action creating the serious risk that major Western states, perhaps aided by Israel, would bypass the Security Council altogether in deciding on an intervention, because this would further erode Russia's rule-making influence and veto power, undermine what we could call its institutional power through the Security Council on the global stage. To explain the Russian stance in global debates and intervention, we need to consider the Russian understanding of domestic state order. So I come here to a core part of my argument. Moscow's conception of international society has reflected a front-rank priority to preserve its domestic structure of power. This domestic structure traditionally has been centralized, hierarchical, and it's given primacy to order over justice, and it's been progressively reinforced under Putin. It's reflected well in Putin's resistance to the transmission of what he describes external norms and values, read as Western values, to the Russian domestic order. And I think this relationship between domestic and international order explains Russia's diplomatic stance in ways that cannot be done just by focusing on power in the international system. In Russia, there's been an emphasis on statist values as the political orthodoxy, talk about sovereign democracy, and this has linked the defense of Russian political order with autonomy in international affairs. Moscow clashed with Western powers over the legitimacy of the coloured revolutions in CIS states and over support for regime change in the Middle East. Russia also resisted broader efforts to advance human security at the expense of state sovereignty. Now, of course, considerations of power and strategy have, to some extent, blurred these differences over values and norms. Since 2001, the war on terror, as principally defined by the United States in a broader coalition, has provided scope for more flexible interpretations of norms in international law. It's loosened their constraining influence on the use of force in general, one may say. By the time Putin returned to his third presidential term, the debate on intervention had shifted its focus from the war on terror, which had had these influence on norms and law, to the Arab Spring. Yet Putin's interpretation of intervention in Libya and the crisis in Syria remained defiantly at odds with those of Western powers. Looking at the last decade, it's the fixation on traditional sovereignty that shines through in Russian pronouncements. Russia's drawn a line between the coloured revolutions in CIS states, US policies for regime change, and to a considerable extent the uprisings of the Arab Spring. And all of these have been presented as externally inspired efforts to transform the domestic order of states for strategic ends, a process which is claimed ultimately threatens Moscow itself. And we can debate whether that, how realistic that kind of perspective is. But I think at root, there's a Russian antipathy to the notion of regime legitimacy, to any in external enforcement action, any link between regime change and external enforcement, the legitimacy of external enforcement. With this view, Russia's actually not that isolated in the wider international community, we should accept. It's a view shared by China, certainly, but also by many other states where regime security is prioritized over human security. A fair number of illiberal states, we could say. And it's also the perspective of those who simply distrust the strong to impose justice as they understand it. I think although Putin was re-elected, his domestic legitimacy at home is uncertain, And he does seem to nurse fears of becoming the object of greater leverage by Western powers, especially the United States, if domestic tensions rise in Russia or the wider CIS region. And I think that this reinforces Moscow's determination to privilege sovereignty at the expense of humanitarian protection in international society. So Putin continues to resist the consolidation of what we could call a human-focused conception of international justice. So this is my framework, and I wish to turn to the Syria crisis to show how this kind of thinking helps explain Russian conduct in that acute crisis. Well, this crisis followed rather predictable acrimony over the Libya campaign. Moscow, in that campaign, rather vociferously rejected the idea that standards of political legitimacy, which leader was legitimate, which was not, devised in Western capitals, whether about democracy or anything else, should influence Western action in Libya. In the Syria crisis, I would argue, the Russian leadership seems to fear a kind of political blowback to their own state, which could follow the example of deposing another authoritarian leader, this time Assad. And they fear this rather more than the other possible impact on Russian state order, the spread of Islamist networks and insurgency in the North Caucasus, although that is also there. And for my money, this controversy about standards of political legitimacy is a main driver of the constancy of Russia's alignment with Damascus. But before saying more about that, I wish briefly to mention a couple of other alternative interpretations or explanations of the Russian alignment with Syria. First, identity and solidarity with the Syrian regime. Could some sense of identity and solidarity drive this relationship? Well, the close association of the Soviet Union and Syria was one, I would say, of strategic interdependence rather than ideologically based. However, arguably, parts of the military security establishment and nationalist opinion in Moscow view Russia's relationship with Syria as an important vestige of past grandeur, Russia as a power in the Middle East. That should be retained and might still be leveraged to regional geopolitical advantage or to uphold Russia's global status as a sort of indispensable power. And from this perspective, Moscow may be reluctant to break with a long-term political base, as it sees it, in the Middle East, in the form of ties to Assad's security elite, which are a mainstay of his regime. This also means, of course, personal support for the beleaguered leadership of Bashar al-Assad himself, to the extent that Assad so clearly personifies the Syrian Alawite regime. And moreover, Putin views the image, the Russian image of being a steadfast ally as important internationally for the credibility of Russia's other political alignments, such as those with CIS Central Asian states. And the touchstone of such credibility is the support for Russia-friendly leaders and their entourage, or at least not to accept Western campaigns to unseat them. So there's that identity argument. Secondly, Russian material and geopolitical interests in Syria, which are quite well discussed. Well, Russia does have a solid arms trade, and we could talk about this more. It would be jeopardized by an overthrow of the Assad regime. And you could say that this influences Russian decision-making to the extent that the Russian defense industry and its supporters have significant bureaucratic weight in policy discussions in Moscow. So this is about the decision-making process in Moscow. But the trade, some 5% of Russia's total arms deliveries abroad in 2011, is just too small to offer a credible explanation for the Russian position in the crisis around Syria. The controversy around the S-300s and whether they should or should not be delivered, in my view, this is more about Russian political calculations around Syria than commercial strategy. So if arms isn't important, I would say more important are Russia's wider strategic interests, which these reflect assessments of the political geometry around Syria and the impact of a collapse of a Shia Alawite rule in the teeth of a largely Sunni Western and Gulf states-supported rebellion. In earlier years, Russian support for Syria and Hamas gave the Kremlin potential leverage and strategic options in the Middle Eastern peace process to counter American and Western policy. So it's partly about the Middle East in the past, but I'd argue that since the end of the 2000s, Russia's viewed the focus of rivalry around Syria as overshadowed by the risk of Western conflict with Iran. So there's the Iran factor. Russian leaders suspect in varying extents that the toppling of Assad is just part of a broader Western strategy for the eventual destabilization of or conflict with Iran. And in this sense, Moscow views this as the kind of macro strategy, and it's consistent with the regional agenda of Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And so Syria then is set up as the site of a proxy war defined largely along Sunni-Shia axis. Moscow argues that Iran should be part of the solution to the Syrian crisis, especially since the election of President Rouhani. An underlying Russian concern, however, has been about the risk that Syria could catalyse a larger Western conflict with Iran in which Russia could find itself an unintended party. It does not want to be in that situation. I'd say for years that Moscow has retained influence in Syria from the combination of Syria's heightened sense of insecurity and its isolation from the West. So that's a good position for Syria to be from the Russian perspective. As long as the Syrian regime is kept in this position, Russia can remain a strategic actor in Middle Eastern diplomacy by leveraging its access to Syria. But this is only possible if the Assad regime retains intact. I'd say in these respects, acting as a broker for the chemical arms agreement with Assad conforms well with Russian strategy. Let me turn to my final core explanations which link Putin's policy on Syria to Russian state order. First, an argument about Russian state order and what I'd say the narrative of Islamist threats. Russian officials have frequently justified their position in the Syria crisis as a kind of bulwark of international order, regional order, against the threat of state collapse, against chaos, the spread of transnational Islamist networks. The emphasis has been on bolstering the Syrian state, purportedly rather than the regime as such. But this Russian narrative is also about the stability of the Russian state, as it suggests the possibility of a spillover of Islamist threats. For Moscow, a chaotic overthrow of Assad, it is suggested, will further fuel sectarianism, expand the scope for action of Sunni Islamist groupings, some of which may take up cause with the insurgency that Russia is battling with in the North Caucasus. Moscow claims that the Syrian opposition is relying increasingly on more extreme Islamist factions, especially the Jabhat al-Nusra, and more recently the Islamic State of Iraq and Al-Sham, ISIS, which is in the news, both linked to Al-Qaeda. This draws attention, among other matters, to the vulnerability of stockpiles of Syrian chemical munitions if Assad's regime were to collapse in disarray. Russia has been arguing since at least early this year that the proliferation danger is a reason to try to avoid any further weakening of the Syrian state and its security apparatus. Russian officials argue that any breakdown of the Syrian state would quickly spread to neighbouring countries, and that chaos and the breakdown of state structures in Muslim lands, coupled with the spread of Islamist networks, threaten to feed back to Russia, to fuel terrorism and militancy in several Russian regions. And it does seem difficult for the Russian elite to dissociate the Syrian conflict from Russia's own experience of Sunni insurgency in the North Caucasus. Indeed, if we look at it, some transnational links between the North Caucasus and Syria may be developing as the killings continue in Syria, and I've looked at some more detail at that. So there's that argument. I think the narrative of Islamist threats and the link to Russian state order. But there's another crucial explanation of Russian commitment to the Assad regime. And this is all about preoccupation with central political control in Moscow. So coming back to my argument towards the beginning of this talk, my early argument. And arguably, it is this that drives Putin's support of incumbent, if illiberal, regimes in Syria and elsewhere. his rejection that Western states can set standards on the political legitimacy of other rulers, and his insistence on the illegality of steps towards regime change. And in this sense, Putin tends to identify in his conviction with Assad that the rule of law, democracy, human rights are all essentially contrivances that allow the West to control weaker states. In this sense, like Assad, Putin prizes regime security. Putin sees potential challenges to central political control in Moscow if the overthrow of another authoritarian regime were to be legitimized internationally. And this is especially so after the large-scale political protests last year. Russian officials tend to talk in conspiratorial terms about certain states' efforts to, quote, orchestrate a Middle Eastern scenario in Russia, using the techniques of earlier coloured revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine. And it seems that since the ouster of President Mubarak in Egypt and throughout the Syria crisis, the dangers of a highly personalised political system characterised by strong centralisation of real political power have resonated among the Russian leadership. So ultimately, Putin's commitment to a global order which prizes the sovereignty of incumbent states, his fixation on not becoming party to a process aimed at regime change in Syria, is largely an external expression of his preoccupation with the Russian domestic state order. And this is an outlook rooted in the structure of political power in Russia, and it's shared by those in security agencies and the elite who have been empowered by Putin's presidencies. But having presented this argument, I also believe that Putin's policy is shaped by beliefs, perhaps inflated beliefs, about Russian status. And even before the recent diplomatic flurry over chemical disarmament, Putin seemed to believe that the tenacity of the Russian position over Syria has earned it greater regional influence, if not sympathy, in the Middle East, as well as an enhanced global status as a central indispensable player in this major international crisis. And Russia's been talking about continuing its traditional role as a, quote, balancing factor in international affairs. In essence, by entrenching itself in the manoeuvring around Syria, Russia hopes to oversee a settlement in Syria alongside Western and regional states, facilitated by the United Nations, so as to enshrine continued Russian influence in the wider region. And this is the outcome Russia seeks from a revival of the efforts of the June 2012 Geneva Communique. In conclusion, does all this in practice leave common ground between Russian, American and Western objectives in the crisis around Syria? Well, in certain respects, I'd say yes. Perhaps not in the areas that my talk previously has focused on, as follows. First, to ensure secure control and eventual elimination of Syrian chemical munition stockpiles, even if this comes at the expense of a continuing Russian role in Syria's security policy. Secondly, to prevent as far as possible the further empowerment of Al-Qaeda-linked Islamist networks and their entrenchment in a wide ungoverned territory encompassing eastern Syria and part of Iraq, which could happen. Thirdly, to avert the risk of a partition of Syria, which would have grave ramifications for neighbouring Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan and elsewhere. Fourth, linked to this, to avert the collapse of Syrian state borders and ever greater refugee flows with the ensuing regional chaos. And fifth, finally, I would say actually as of the June 2013 G8 summit already, apparently partial, not wholesale, regime change in Syria. If we look at the summit communique in particular, it noted that a transition in Syria should preserve the, quote, military forces and security services, unquote, if not necessarily the top leadership. And there it seemed the movement was more on the Western side than the Russian side in reaching that communique. But beyond this, Putin certainly expects the whole chemical disarmament process will act to consolidate Russian influence over any revived international peace process. Moscow will exert leverage as it presents itself as an indispensable party to this process, and is bound to claim that the cohesion rather than the turnover of the Syrian regime is essential to the success of efforts to strip Syria of its chemical arsenal. Russia will also continue to block any Security Council Chapter 7 threat of force against Assad's forces, even if Damascus begins a cat-and-mouse action foot-dragging over their chemical arms. Overall, Putin may well conclude that his obduracy over the Syria crisis for over 2 years, his military support for Damascus, coupled by some deft diplomacy when a fortuitous opening was offered over chemical arms, has prevailed. That has prevailed against a Western logic of intervention under the guise of humanitarianism. But whether we accept this or not, it leaves the gravest humanitarian crisis in the contemporary world unresolved. And still, sadly, for all the talk of revived negotiations, with no end in sight.